Welcome back to our midweek message. We have been in a series on hearing the voice of God, and today is our last installment in this series. And so if you've enjoyed this midweek series and you want to hear more, just drop a comment below and let me know what you'd like me to teach on. But today, I want to finish our series on hearing God's voice. We've laid the foundation for hearing God's voice, and last week we started with some practical keys to hearing God's voice. And so the first key was proximity. Spending time in God's presence puts us in proximity to hear His voice. And so if you want to hear the voice of God, you need to get into the presence of God. And so today I want to pick up where we left off from our last message and share two more practical keys with you. The second one is perception. Job 33:14 says this, "For God speaks again and again, though people do not perceive it." This verse says that God is speaking to us again and again. The problem is we don't perceive or recognize His voice. See, most people are looking for God to speak to them in these loud and obvious ways that they don't recognize that God has already been speaking to them. They just didn't recognize it. And so if you are going to perceive God's voice, then you need to know the most common ways that God speaks to us. And see, the main ways that God speaks are through impressions, thoughts, and pictures. Let's talk more about those. Number one, impressions. Sometimes these impressions come as feelings, emotions, or intuition. You'll have an impression or a feeling about a situation, or you'll feel a leading to do something that is independent of knowledge. You know, one time my wife was driving in the car and she just had this impression to put her seatbelt on, and she just kind of ignored the impression, and within a few moments she was pulled over for a seatbelt violation. Like, have you ever felt maybe impressed just to go and pray for someone at church or to go and do something for someone? That was most likely God speaking to you. But many times we talk ourselves out of it, thinking, oh, they'll just think that I'm weird, and you talk yourself out of it in the moment. And when you talk yourself out of it, you kind of get this sick feeling in your stomach. That feeling you get in your gut when you don't step out and do something, that's one of the ways that you know that it was God that was actually speaking to you. And the second one we mentioned were thoughts. And this is one of the hardest to recognize because we think thousands of thoughts each day. So how do you know which thoughts are your thoughts and which thoughts are God's thoughts? And see, God's thoughts are spontaneous. They do not originate in your mind or through normal thinking process. Have you ever had a random thought about somebody you hadn't seen in a really long time, and then you run into them later that day? Or maybe you call them and talk to them on the phone and you find out that they're actually going through a really hard time? See, that was God putting that thought in your head to pray for them or to reach out to them and see how they're doing. See, you had not been thinking of them, but that thought almost came out of nowhere. And that is what spontaneous thoughts are like. Right? They just kind of come, they don't come from your normal thinking process. The normal thinking process is that one thought triggers another, which triggers another that led you to think about that person. God thoughts are spontaneous. God thoughts are so easy to miss because they are so subtle that you can pass them off as your own thoughts. The first time this happened to me, I was standing outside talking with my next door neighbor, and they weren't Christians, and they were trying to sell their house. And the house had been on the market for months, and they hadn't even had someone come and look at their house. I mean, they had zero interest in their house for months. And so I'm standing there talking to them, and the thought comes into my head, tell them their house is going to sell in 3 days. And I felt like God wanted me to tell them that their house was going to sell in 3 days, but then I thought, wait a minute, no, that was just me. That couldn't have been God. And so I walked away and I didn't say anything. And guess what happened 3 days later? Their house sold. I felt absolutely terrible because I missed an incredible opportunity to show them the reality of God and I missed it because I didn't recognize that the thought about their house selling in 3 days was a God thought. So don't dismiss random, spontaneous thoughts that come to your mind. It just might be God speaking to you. And then the third one that we mentioned were pictures. This is one of the ways that God speaks to me the most, right? God will show you a picture in your mind and you'll just know what that picture means. One time I was praying for this girl that I had never met before, and I saw a picture of a branding iron with the word love written on it. And I said, you've been branded, you've been marked by God's love. And suddenly this girl just starts laughing and she looked at me and she said, I just got a tattoo of God's love on my back. I'm literally marked by God's love. And see, that came to me as a picture. And see, these God pictures come to us in our imagination. Like right now, I want you to imagine a dessert in your mind. See, that is exactly what it looks like when God gives you a picture. It's clear, but it's faint. You can picture it, but it's not like you're looking at a photograph. And so these pictures are so faint and subtle that you think that, it was just you, that you just made it up, but don't dismiss them because it just might be God speaking to you. And see, these are the most common ways that God speaks to us: impressions, thoughts, and pictures. And remember, these all come in the form of a gentle whisper. They are so subtle that if you aren't paying attention, you won't perceive it. You'll just think it's your thoughts, your imaginations, your feelings, and you'll miss God's voice. But if you start looking for God to speak to you in these ways, you'll be able to perceive the voice of God when He speaks to you. And number 3, practice, right? I heard a story about a man in Minnesota who decided to go ice fishing. He had his drill and all his gear, and he went out to drill a hole in the ice. And just before he put the drill into the ice, he heard this booming voice that sounded like the voice of God that says, "There are no fish there." And he thought, wow, God is speaking to me about catching fish. So he moved over to another spot and he started to drill a hole in the ice. And about halfway through, he heard the voice again say, "There are no fish there." So he moves over to another spot and he starts drilling and he hears this booming voice again. "This is the ice rink attendant. There are no fish here." Come on, that's funny. I don't care what you say. See, sometimes it's hard to know if God is really talking to you. So how do you know if what you just heard is God? Practice. We had a guest speaker at our church a couple years ago named Bob Hazlett, and this guy can hear the voice of God. He hears God's voice with a level of accuracy that is scary. But he learned to hear the voice of God working at Chick-fil-A. See, when Bob started working at Chick-fil-A, his job was making fries. And making fries is all about timing, because once they make the fries, they are only supposed to sit out for 5 minutes. And after 5 minutes, they're supposed to throw them out. So if he made the fries too early, he would have to throw them out. And if he made the fries too late and they got a big rush of people, then they would hold up the line waiting on fries because they wouldn't be ready. So he's at work one day and it is completely dead. And he felt like God said, "Make the fries now." And he was like, "God, it's completely dead. There's nobody here." But he couldn't ignore this feeling. And so he went with it and he made the fries. In the moment he pulled those fries out, a huge rush of people came through and they had just enough fries for everyone. And so every day when he went to work, he would ask God to speak to him about when to make the fries. And that is where he practiced hearing God's voice. Now he has an unbelievable prophetic ministry, and it all started by practicing hearing God's voice at work. See, you can read every book on hearing God's voice, but if you don't actually take the time to practice hearing God's voice, you'll never grow in your ability to hear His voice. So you have to practice. Hearing God's voice is not an exact science. There will be times when you thought you heard God's voice, but you were completely wrong. So it's important that we test everything we hear from God. In Acts 13, Paul and Barnabas were praying and fasting and seeking God, and God spoke to them and called them into ministry. And they prayed and fasted more and even talked to the church leadership about it before they left. They didn't leave immediately. It says this in Acts 13:3. Then, having fasted and prayed and laid hands on them, they sent them away. And so they prayed about what God spoke to them. And they talked with the church leadership and received their blessing before they did what God spoke to them. And there are a couple of filters that we should use to test everything that we hear from God, because we don't want to do something that we will regret later. And so these filters will help us identify whether it's God or not. Number one, is it scriptural? The first thing you need to ask yourself when you think you've heard from God is, does this line up with the teaching in Scripture? I once had someone tell me that God told them that they were going to marry someone in our church. And I was like, nah, bro, God didn't tell you that, because she's already married to somebody else. He said, look, man, I was praying about it, and I opened the drawer of my dresser, and there was this piece of paper, and her name was written on it. I said, look, I don't care if an angel showed up in your bedroom and told you that she's going to be your wife. God will never tell you to do something that is contrary to His word. Number two, does it line up with God's character? See, there are some things that Scripture isn't clear about, or some things that just aren't mentioned in Scripture at all. And so if God tells you to do something and it isn't mentioned in Scripture, then you need to ask yourself, does this line up with the character and nature of God? Is what God asking you to do in line with His character? Could you see Jesus doing it? If you couldn't see Jesus doing it, then chances are God isn't asking you to do it either. Number three, is it wise? Proverbs 4:6 says this, do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. Over and over again in Scripture, we are told to follow wisdom. And when God speaks to you, it will always follow wisdom. Now, the wisdom of God is different than the wisdom of men. And sometimes what God asks you to do doesn't seem wise in the eyes of the world. Like giving up a basketball scholarship to follow God doesn't look wise to many people. Selling everything you own to move to another country to be a missionary doesn't seem wise in the world's eyes either. And so when God tells you to do something, it always follows wisdom, but it might not follow the wisdom of this world. And number four, what do the people you trust the most think about it? Proverbs 11:14 says this, where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. In Acts 13, when they heard God speak to them, they brought it to the church leadership first and received their blessing. And so whenever you sense God speaking to you, find 2 or 3 Christ followers who are further down their spiritual path than you are, and share with them what you feel like God is speaking to you. But everything that God speaks to you should go through these filters. Thank you so much for listening to this message. Remember, if you want more messages like this, just drop a comment below and let me know what topic you would like to hear me speak on. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic evening.